today, we're going to talk about the Anoxomat III anaerobic jar system. So who am I to talk to you about the Anoxomat anaerobic jar system? So my name is John Flasher. I am a medical laboratory scientist by trade. I spent about 5 or 6 years on the clinical microbiology bench, but today I'm a senior clinical product manager at Advanced Instruments. So that is me as a young man, a less beardier man, as you'll see in a couple of minutes here when I jump on camera to walk you through the Anoxomat demo. And those are some real pictures I took from the lab. So those of you who are from the micro lab, I mean, on the left, you know exactly what that is. That looks like a nice, slimy Klebsiella. And then on the right, that's a real picture that I actually took of Anascaris lumbricoides. So that's one of the most interesting things that I've seen when I was in the microbiology lab, outside of some of the cool stuff that we can sometimes pull out of these maybe not so cool smelling anaerobic jars. Okay, so why is this so important? Why do we do anaerobic culture identification? So I'm just going to highlight a few of some of the more common anaerobes, or some really interesting anaerobes for sure, with these three here. So not to gross everybody out, but I think the audience here is well primed for things like this. So Fusobacterium necrophorum, it's something that causes Lemierre syndrome. It typically presents in patients just with, pharyngitis. They have a sore throat, and then it progresses into a more severe fever, unilateral neck pain. You get a mass, it becomes really tender. You can see the mass there in the picture of this patient who is probably suffering from jugular vein thrombosis, and that could even develop more severely into septic shock, which we know puts patients at risk of death. So that's what Fusobacterium necrophorum looks like there on that culture. And then there's things like Bacteroides fragilis. These usually like to insist in abscesses. They hide themselves walled off in an abscess, which is great for creating those anaerobic environments. They're typically associated with abdominal discomfort and are very easily improperly diagnosed. So this is something that is kind of, maybe down at the bottom of things that your providers may be investigating for. So it's really important that we have the right tools to make sure we give them those results quickly when we do identify something like this in our patient's GI tract. And then Clostridium perfringens, I think we all know this one. It causes gangrene. We know how it presents very disgustingly, with gas under the skin, a lot of drainage from the tissue, textbook discoloration and turning black, very foul smelling. So, when you get this in your anaerobic culture, whatever your mechanism for anaerobic culture is, you know exactly how it smells as soon as you open up the box or a jar or take it out of the chamber, whatever method you're using. It's treated with antibiotics, debridement, which sounds really terrible, and hyperbaric therapy, or in severe cases, as we know from any mountaineering movie, or any maybe old war movie, amputation. Okay. So why do we identify these anaerobes? And we know they can sometimes be very nasty and cause some pretty terrible ailments, but they're often the causative agents of some very serious conditions that are associated with significant mortality. So around 13% based on some research. The incidence of these clinically significant bacteria are greater in the presence of comorbidities. So typically, if we have a patient in the hospital or somebody who's been suffering from some other comorbidity for quite some time, maybe they're recovering from a GI surgery, they have a hematological malignancy, somebody suffering from organ failure, liver failure, or even something like diabetes mellitus, these conditions put our patients at a greater risk of having an anaerobic infection, and at a greater risk of being pooled into that group of patients who are infected, who have that mortality rate of around 13%. And as most of us in the microbiology lab know, another important application of anaerobic culture is for orthopedic specimens. So your ortho surgeons might send down pieces of tissue from surgeries to make sure they didn't introduce any bacteria, called Cutibacterium acnes, previously called Propionibacterium acnes. And that's something that we typically check for as well, that we commonly apply our anaerobic workflow to rule out. So in most cases, patients suffering from these infections are covered by empirically prescribed antibiotics. So typically the drugs that a physician might give a patient who they suspect might be suffering from some infectious agent. We'll cover these, but sometimes they're not. So making sure that we identify the anaerobic organisms quickly is really important because it makes sure that the antibiotic coverage that we've already employed works, and it informs any changes necessary to make sure that we're putting them on the right coverage if the empiric therapy isn't appropriate. But we all knew that here, so why don't we jump into talking about our Anoxomat III anaerobic jar system. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into the screen here and more formally introduce myself outside of the much younger version of myself that I just showed you on the slide before. So as I had mentioned, my name is John Flasher. I'm a senior clinical product manager here at Advanced Instruments, responsible for the Anoxomat anaerobic jar system, as well as our osmometer product line, which includes that Osmo Pro Max that I highlighted on that opening slide there. So a little bit about myself. Again, I'm a medical laboratory scientist by trade. I spent most of my time in the microbiology lab. And when I was in the microbiology lab, I actually used an Anoxomat jar system. So it was the previous version, the Anoxomat II, this being the Anoxomat III. I haven't used this one specifically in practice in the laboratory, but I can tell you that these Anoxomat anaerobic jar systems really make a difference in terms of the quality of the cultures themselves, your ability to more quickly report meaningful preliminary results, depending on when you go check up on growth for the first time in your anaerobic culture workflow. And I'll show you some pretty neat software features because they can really help you determine when the appropriate time is to check for growth for these cultures, depending on when you like to do that. As well as tracking the patient samples in each of the jars, which jars were used for the patient samples that you're tracking, and you can even track who generated the anaerobic environment and placed the jars in the incubator as well. So there's a bunch of really cool features tacked on to the user interface of the Anoxomat system that really make life easier in terms of your anaerobic workflow as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is just kind of walk you through at face value everything that comes with the Anoxomat III system. So over here, you're going to get a printer, which is really important for your QC readout. There's a really robust QC mechanism that the Anoxomat III employs that really sets it apart from other sachet-based mechanisms that rely on that, that little blue strip that we put in there. Sometimes we typically, when we use a sachet-based method, have to wait around 2 hours to really generate an anaerobic environment for the bugs that we're trying to grow in those boxes. And sometimes by the time we go check up on that little blue strip to make sure that it turned white, we go back and guess what? It's still blue. And then we missed our chance to grow our anaerobe, or we really decrease the likelihood that we'll be able to recover the anaerobe from whatever our primary sample type was. So this system really helps you avoid that. And when I walk you through the UI, I'll show you exactly how it does that. But the printout is an important part of how we track those QC mechanisms. We have a scanner here. So I talked a little bit about tracking and tracing the different samples in jars. So that helps with that. And I'll show you exactly how in a little bit. I'll cross over to the other side here. With this also comes a few different types of anaerobic jars themselves. So this big one is our legacy jar. If you've used some of the older systems, you've definitely seen this and are familiar with it. It holds 3 towers of plates, and so it can hold a total of 36 plates altogether. We have this other acrylic jar as well. It holds microtiter plates and 2 racks. So it actually has a rack in place right now that's intended to hold your 96 well plates. So this jar is really, kind of a jack of all trades in terms of what kinds of things it can accommodate, not only for anaerobic and microaerophilic culture, but also for media reduction, which is important for a lot of labs who are trying to save a little bit of money on generating their own pre-reduced media for anaerobic culture growth in their laboratories. So another thing we're really excited about with this instrument are these cool ergonomic jars, which are our newest line of jars. So they look like this. This is our largest one. It holds 2 towers of 12 plates. So this will actually hold 24 plates. It has a handy little handle, and it actually has a place right in the middle here where it's easy to drop in your palladium catalyst or your Pallinox catalyst. And I'll show you what that looks like here in just a moment. And then this is our smaller version of that exact same jar. This one holds 12 plates, so 2 stacks of 6. It's really easy to unclip and clip these jars back into place to make sure that you get a consistent seal every time. And again, a handy little handle. And what's even cooler about it is, you know, in deference to these larger jars, you can fit these together like little puzzle pieces. So I can go ahead and take these two little peanut-shaped jars and fit them together like puzzle pieces. So if you can imagine what your incubator looks like right now, if you're sitting on the bench in the laboratory, you can even look over and look at it. It's probably a mess of towers and stacks of plates waiting to be read or incubating. So this really helps you kind of reduce the amount of space that you take up with your anaerobic jars and leave some room for some other things that you'll have to eventually go in and check up on in your busy workflow. So that's what we use to accommodate as far as jars. And then our primary consumable for this instrument is going to be the Paradox Palladium catalyst. So as part of how we generate the anaerobic environment using the Anoxomat system, what we'll do is use the Macintosh Fildes method to actually take all of the gas that's out of the jar, creating a vacuum, and then filling it with the appropriate gas mixture from an external gas source. So this instrument does require an external gas source that you get from a medical gas provider like air gas. So it will actually take the gas from the external gas source, create the anaerobic or microaerophilic environment in the jar, and then it will evacuate again, refill, evacuate again, and refill one time. So it goes through this whole process 3 times and then one last time. But after that last filling of the final gas mixture in the jar, there's a bit of residual oxygen that we don't want hanging around, potentially affecting the growth of our anaerobes. So that's what Paradox is for. So it removes that residual oxygen, making sure that we reduce the oxygen content in the generated environment down to 0. So that does not inhibit any of the growth of the anaerobes that we're trying to get out of our anaerobic jar system. So that's what Paradox is used for. I'll go ahead and set this aside here. So with that said, that's the overview of the instrument as a whole. I will say also, and I'll show you how these hook up, that you can accommodate up to 4 jar hookups over here. So if you have a really busy anaerobic workflow, maybe you're performing a lot of those cultures from your orthodox to rule out Cutibacterium acnes growth, and you have several plates that you're loading into multiple jars all at once, you can connect up to 4 jars at once with these hoses on the side. If your workflow changes throughout your ownership of the instrument and you need to modify the instrument to accommodate for more jar connections, we can also do that as well. All right, with that said, I'm gonna go ahead and we're gonna take a look at how this thing works and some of the cool features that comes with this user interface when you buy an Anoxomat system. So this is what the home screen looks like on your Anoxomat system. If you want to go ahead and generate a microaerophilic for your campy or anaerobic environment, all you have to do is first go ahead and take one of the hoses off the side, like I mentioned before. Load your plates up into the jar. So I've got a couple dummy plates in here. So I have a couple dummy plates with a little barcode on them, no media in them. Go ahead and load your plates up into the jar. If you're going to be setting up an anaerobic culture, again, you're going to need this Paradox Palladium catalyst to make sure that you can reduce all of the oxygen out of the environment. We're not actually going to be setting up an anaerobic environment because I don't have an external gas hookup set up here in the demo room in Norwood. But what I can show you is the microaerophilic recipe, which is exactly what I'm going to do. But I also wanted to show you how the palladium catalyst is loaded into the jar. So after you've loaded up your plates, you simply put the lid on, you clip it closed, and make sure you hear that nice, satisfying snap when you close it. You go ahead and take this jar and you attach it. And then once it attaches, we'll go back to this screen here. All right. You'll select your recipe. Like I said here, we're set up to do the microaerophilic recipe. So I'd go ahead and select that recipe. And then all you do is just hit the start button. So the first thing that it's going to do, again, it's going to take it through a bunch of quality control checks. So the first thing you're going to see is that the pressure input, so the gas pressure incoming from your external gas source is appropriate, which it is for this. So we have a green check up there. And then down below where you see the different jar connections, you'll see jar 1, 2, and 3. I've only connected one jar, and I was using the jar 1 hose, so the instrument actually automatically identifies which hose is connected to a jar. Once it does that, it's going to start those evacuation and gas fill cycles that I was mentioning before. So you saw up on the right-hand side where it says stabilizing now, before it said evacuating. So actually removes as much of the air from the jar that it can, and then it refills it. And then using different pressure sensing mechanisms, the system's actually going to check to make sure that there is no leakage between the lid and the body of the jar itself. And then once it completes that test, it will confirm that there is no leakage and we're good to go there. And as you can see down along the bottom where it says jar, connected, leak test, seal, catalyst test, and ready, it's going to move on to the seal leak test. So again, confirming that we have a strong seal between the jar and the lid when the jar is filled with our appropriate gas mixture. So the first check was a leak test when we create a vacuum in the jar. And the second is a seal test of the jar after we've replaced the gas with the appropriate environment in the jar. And then typically after the seal leak test, if you were running an anaerobic environment, you would also see a catalyst check. And the catalyst check is going to actually be sensing very small pressure changes over a given amount of time, a short period of time, to ensure that the palladium catalyst in the jar is doing its job eliminating that residual oxygen within that environment. So since we're doing a microaerophilic recipe this time around, we're not able to actually show you what that catalyst check would look like. But after completing the fill and evacuation cycles, it's actually going to go to ready. And that's really all there is to it in terms of generating that environment. Once it's ready, it'll read as finished. And then over here, this little receipt will pop out of the printer. And you can actually see along the bottom of the receipt all of those different QC checks. Up here on the top, you can see the date and time when your culture was set up, what recipe you were using. So I was using a microaerophilic recipe. And even more specific down here are the concentration of gases that were included in generating your, in this case, microaerophilic recipe as well. So everything gets printed out on this sheet. You can go ahead and just stick it on your jars or clip it to your jars, however you want to do that. Or you can go ahead and file this away to be stored for an audit trail or a paper trail or whatever you might need that for. So that's how simple it is at the most basic level to run this instrument. Additionally, though, there are some other features that are pretty cool that I want to tell you guys about. So I'll go ahead and just go back into our user interface here. Once you complete it, you can just go ahead and hit start again to return to the home page. So there are a couple cool things about this instrument I want to show you. First is that if you buy the appropriate software package, you can actually pre-program custom recipes. So let's say your laboratory has a particular research project where you're trying to grow one type of bug. Maybe it's a capnophile. You can go ahead and create a capnophilic recipe using the appropriate gas mixture. You can go into here and go to new recipe. You can name your recipe here, and then you can use these little slides along the bottom to actually change the concentration of your gas inputs relative to one another in your custom recipe. So it makes kind of creating these custom recipes really easy on the fly if that's something that you want to do in your laboratory. And you can store a bunch of these. So I can go page by page and show you some custom recipes that we've created in past demos here as well. So a really cool feature. In addition to that, I talked about that track and trace mechanism. So a setup code is something that you're going to get with every instrument that you purchase new. So I'm going to go ahead and put in my setup code for my instrument. By the way, you also get this handy little stylus too, which makes life a lot easier when you're using the screen, especially when you have big fingers like me. So you can see all of these different options that you can interact with on the setup menu. The option that I really want to highlight for the purposes of this demo is the registration menu. So first things first, you can give this instrument a nickname if you want to. So you can call your lab something. You can call yourselves, you can just be really generic and say micro, not with 2 C's on purpose. And then department ID, you can say that you're the best. Let's just do that. We can call you the best. And then there's 2 other options as well. So there's jar setup and there's registered users. So if you want to track which users are generating each of the environments that you're creating in the lab, you go to the register users menu and you can put in somebody's name here. Let's say, I know we have our rep on the call who supports Anoxomat. Her name is Jamie Rich. She's really wonderful. She is a former med tech herself. She's extremely knowledgeable, and she'll be able to answer any questions you have. We're going to add her as a user. And then because it's our 70th birthday here at Advanced Instruments, we'll go ahead and put in a 70 for Jamie and hit submit. So over here, you can see that we've created a registered user. So when we actually go and create that environment the next time around, it's going to ask us for that user code. And we're going to put in the number 70, which is going to be specific to Jamie. And then when we get a printout of that receipt after the QC passes and the environment has been created before we actually put the culture in the incubator to incubate, it'll show that Jamie was the one who set that culture up. So a great way to track who's doing what in your laboratory if that's something that's important to you. Another important feature here is jar setup. So if you're a laboratory, for example, that wants to keep track of which jar is being used when, which samples are being loaded into the jars that you've identified, as well as what the incubation time or temperature should be, this is a great menu for tracking those details. So I'm going to go ahead and select jar ID. And the way that you're able to designate jar ID is just by putting a barcode. It can be a generic barcode. I just have these little dummy barcodes for sample tubes that I put on the jars, but you can really use anything that is scannable via a barcode scanner. So here you can also add, a reference or a sample ID. I'm going to go ahead and click sample ID as if I was scanning in a session number into the instrument. You can indicate if you're putting an O2 indicator in the jar. We're not doing that. But another cool feature that I like is incubation time, because as we know, we have to be very careful about how we organize our cultures based on when they're inoculated in the laboratory, so we know we're not trying to read their preliminary growth results prematurely. So that's something that is really helpful with this feature as well. Here we're going to select this so that we can enable the ability to scan multiple IDs. And then this pre-scan button, just make sure that we have the option to scan those plates in to this jar before we actually go ahead and generate that anaerobic environment. So a really cool feature there. We're going to say yes to saving the changes. I'm going to close this out and save those changes. And as you can see here, we have this option to scan. I don't think I'm going to have time to actually run another run before we announce the winner of the lab coat drawing. But what I can show you is how we might scan ahead of actually running the atmosphere generation, our plates into the jar that we would be using. So again, I have my dummy plates here. And then on the top of this jar, I have a barcode that is identifying this jar to the barcode ID that's also on my label. And all I'm going to do is take the scanner and first scan the jar, telling the instrument, hey, this is where I'm going to be putting all of the plates that I'm about to scan into the scan samples column. So right now, I'm just going to take my plates that were in the jar. I'm going to go ahead and scan those in so you can see the first set of plates are being scanned in. And I've tossed these around a little bit, I guess. So the second set of plates are being scanned in there. So I'll go ahead and place those back in my jar. And then we'll go ahead and just accept what we've scanned in. And then I'll at least show you really briefly what it looks like when I go to set up another run. So I'll go ahead and attach. I'll select my recipe. I'll hit start. First, it's going to ask for that user code. Again, because it's our 70th birthday, I gave Jamie Rich, our Anoxomat account manager, that user code ID. We're going to go ahead and hit start. And then again, it's going to go through all the same initial checks. First, it's going to make sure that the pressure input is adequate, which it is. It's going to detect that that first jar connector is attached to a jar. And then instead of continuing through the atmosphere generation like it did last time, it's going to prompt us to do something else. It's going to say, hey, can you tell me what jar you're using to generate this anaerobic environment, or in this case, this microaerophilic environment? So I'll go ahead and just scan that jar again. And then it will ask me, so do you want to make sure that we account for all of the samples that you put into that jar, of which I will say yes. And then this is the really cool part over here. It's going to ask me how long I want to incubate it. So if you're a lab that will go in and check for growth at the 48-hour mark, you go in and actually open up that jar and see if anything's growing in there. Then you go ahead and put in 48 hours and you'll hit start. And what's cool is, and it's going to take a few minutes to actually generate that printout, but what's cool is it will actually show you exactly, based on when you set up the culture, when you should go back and check for growth of that culture. So at the 48-hour mark, it's going to have a little note on your receipt, on your printout, that will say, hey, you set this culture up on April 25th at 1:30 p.m. And then it will give me a time exactly 48 hours from now as to when I should check for growth. So you can use that information to make sure you're lumping all of those cultures, anaerobic culture jars together, that you'll be checking for growth at that same 48-hour interval, or within, you know, a reasonable amount of time based on when those cultures were set up. So a really cool feature of the Anoxomat system as well, to make sure that you're keeping track of who's doing what in your lab and where your samples are for all of the different jars that you employ for anaerobic culture growth. All right, with that said, we can hang on here for a few more minutes for folks who have time, want to stick around and ask a few questions. I think first, for those who need to go, we should announce the lab coat drawing winner. So without further ado, Jordan, do we have a winner? Melanie Flippin? It's Melanie Flippin. So congratulations, Melanie. You are the winner of our lab coat drawing. And we will be following up with you early next week to confirm the details of your shipping address. Make sure we can get that cool Scooby-Doo lab coat out to you promptly. Thanks so much for attending. All right, any questions that we have in the chat? Anything anybody wants to ask before we get back to wrapping up our Friday in the lab and head into the weekend? All right. I don't think we have any questions in the chat. With that said, I think we're all eager to close out the workday and head home today for some much needed R&R. So I just want to say, for those of you who have attended this meeting or any of our other meetings this week, thank you so much again for joining. We appreciate you and your interest in our products and learning a little bit more about what these do for our patients. And we'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have moving forward as well. Thank you so much for joining, and happy Lab Week.